And my question to all of you, and you tapped on it in your talk a little bit already, but now please answer. What, in your view, also having heard all the talks, what is the one important first step to make to start a spiral of change instead of the spiral of inaction? So what do you think is an important step to do?
Okay, now I'm regretting being first. I guess I think partly inspired as well by Jinren's PhD, but also work by colleagues like Steve Westlake. I wonder if it is about high-profile people taking action, so leaders really visibly taking climate action. That could be within their own behaviour, but also, I think, importantly, developing policies, ambitious climate policies that send a signal that this is something that society as a whole thinks is important. We as leaders are taking this seriously, and that signal, I think, could then contribute to kind of wider social change and support for more action. So yeah, that might be my first thing. Yeah.
Very good. It's linked to what's one of the strategies that many indicate, right? I can't remember the first strategy. That's you can start with government. Or not, you're actually saying the high influential rich people.
Yeah, it could be rich people, but actually I was thinking more like policymakers in particular. I mean, leaders generally, but policymakers particularly because they are the ones that can remove some of the biggest barriers to behaviour change as well. So yeah, I would say kind of government leaders have to take action.
Good, thanks.
I think, I mean, my answer would be related. I think that, well, as a lot of us have kind of mentioned, I think this can often start with small minorities, individuals who are willing to push for things that go outside of what is expected in their context. So, and I think that encouraging those people to think about what are the different things I could be doing, I think is a really nice strategy. So looking to Shana's work as well, thinking about in professional roles, what are the actual different things I can do beyond what is expected, and forming allegiances and collaborations, I think is really good for like-minded people, seeking out people that can support you in that.
Studying people's perceptions of other people's interiority, their perceived norms. One of the things that comes up that I was thinking about in relation to Zwarte Piet, right? The way in which Zwarte Piet is both prototypical of norm change, but maybe not therefore generalizable, is the visibility of it. Like it's extremely visible, right? Definitionally visible. Whereas so much of what we would like to replicate that isn't visible. I always joke with my collaborators of like, everyone cares about recycling, no one cares about net zero supply chain policies, because if you're outside of the C-suite, you don't see the net zero supply chain policies. Consumers don't see it, vast majority of people in the organization don't see it. And figuring out how to make these things visible, right, and positive, and having some sort of, not just visible in the sense that people are aware of it, but of an affirmative behavior that people can change to. And that's so hard in so many of these domains.
Many things have been said already. I think that, I think it relates to many of those things. And also where I ended my presentation with, I think it's also a slightly more optimistic view of where people care about, and then not only by citizens ourselves or the general public, but particularly within organizations, within governments, also that they feel more empowered to take these kind of actions. I think that's something which is really critical to get this change happening.
Okay, so how to add something to this? I guess perhaps zooming a bit out. So I think our natural tendency is just to look at the world as what it is right now is always how it needs to be. And if you zoom out, everything is shifting all the time. Like we don't see a tree growing because it goes so slowly. And I think basically what all of the, perhaps the previous speakers also, I guess, signal is that there's a big momentum, or there's a big untapped potential for change. And sometimes we just need to be a bit more patient and not lose hope if things are not changing overnight, I guess. Yeah. I guess having some successful examples indeed perhaps gives us that concrete hope.
Good. Thanks. Any questions, comments from the audience? Yeah.
I'm just interested in the comment around signals and cues, because that would depend on people interpreting those cues correctly and not misperceiving them for other motivations. So I guess my question is very broad in the sense like the next step would be to ensure that people are interpreting those cues correctly, or that they're being presented in a way that the motivation is clear that it is for sustainable reasons and not for another reason. But that also probably depends on where that person's coming from as well, the interpreter. Do you have any insights?
That's a really good point, and actually it does relate to a discussion we've been having around kind of moralisation as a route to wider social change, but also the fact that, for example, with electric vehicles, people are mostly adopting those because of more, say, self-interested reasons as well, like saving money and energy security concerns. Similarly, the war in Iran now has had this impact that people are investing in solar panels and heat pumps and electric vehicles because of financial concerns and security concerns. So I think in terms of then the signalling, if a government puts in place a policy which enables people to have heat pumps and electric vehicles, for example, I don't know how much it matters that people perceive that as being for climate reasons or for other reasons, if the result is that people then change their behaviour to adopt those things. So if the behaviour changes the outcome, then maybe it doesn't really matter why they're perceiving what the motivations are perceived to be. I guess if you wanted wider support for climate policies, then it probably does matter that you're sort of linking that to actually this is a climate crisis and that's why the government is doing it. So I guess it might be helpful that they're not only talking about this is to save you money and to enable you to still travel in an energy crisis, but also that they're saying, and this is because it's a climate crisis. So given particularly that there is polarization around kind of net zero policies, maybe it helps for those leaders to talk about the multiple reasons why they're doing it.
No, I do think it's very important to talk about it. I think that actually one risk of focusing on the behavior itself, I think, and also the other reason, I think it can be a good strategy to let people adopt a certain behavior for other reasons as well. I think the risk with it is that it only applies to that specific behavior. There's also with a lot of literature on norms, which are often quite specifically attached to a specific behavior that people perform, that you see it influences that behavior. But whether it affects other behaviors which contribute to the same overarching goal really depends on whether people see this underlying motivation behind it. So I think it is important to communicate this underlying motivation for that reason. So I think if you focus on a single behavior, I think it doesn't matter for what reason people do it. It might stimulate them to perform that behavior as well. But if you want to, which you need for tackling climate change, you need a broad range of behaviors. I think it's actually essential to move back to those motivations and also make them very visible and show them in order to basically get those wider behaviors or this wider change. And actually what I also think is quite interesting, because I think the examples that you just mentioned, like the electrical vehicles and the solar panels, for instance, I think it's often how people talk with each other about it, but I doubt whether those are the reasons why they adopt it. Because I think many people also say they do it for financial reasons or these kind of things, simply because they think this is the most rational, appropriate way of sort of justifying why you took that action. And maybe if you say I did it for environmental reasons, people think, activists or something like that. So I actually doubt whether those reasons people provide are actually the real reasons. And we also see very strong misperceptions in that regard. And we also see that actually among EV owners, many people do indicate that one of the main reasons is sustainability, but that people don't perceive it of each other, particularly among early adopters as well.
I think it's also an important topic because with discussions that I have with policymakers and also with local initiative takers, they often assume that money or more the egoistic motives are the main drivers of behavior, and that they also develop tools and instruments targeting these motivations. So it's really important also emphasize the climate goal for the reasons that were already expressed, but also because this is not what they really think about first. Parker?
I was going to say, just to make this really personal, I suspect many people in the room have the experience that I have as a vegetarian. Is you tell someone you're vegetarian, you get the question like, well, for health or ethical reasons. And I have a practice script for why I think the production of meat is unethical in a way that's like typically not threatening to the person who's offering me something I don't want to eat. And I think it is like, I consider that like really important to communicate those norms and just taking it upon myself to make sure I have a way of expressing it that's clear and definitive, but non-threatening. And yeah.
Can I jump on that? So what's your experience if you don't use that script? Like what happens?
Oh, you mean as in if I get the question but don't respond, or?
Well, I guess so what you're trying to do is not elicit defensiveness.
Yeah, not defensive.
So why do you do that? And what happens if you don't do that? If you say,
I mean, part of the problem is I have an extremely high tolerance for making other people uncomfortable. So, but I have like a frame, right? And one of the true frames is like, I come from the U.S. and in the U.S. the protections for the treatment of animals is much lower. And so I usually frame it around there, just like the factory farming in the U.S. But there's also there's a lot of ways in which I make the people around me more comfortable, right? That you can cite other values too about like waste, right? Like I don't eat meat, but if I get served meat that's been prepared for me, I'll eat it because otherwise it's wasteful. I will never prepare meat for myself. But yeah, I think you just have to sit with that discomfort. I think that is why it's so hard, right? Because it's going to make people uncomfortable, right? And like it's the vegan problem of like there's a lot of people who really hate vegans, and there's a lot of research showing it's because they're perceived as being moralizers and judgmental of the people who are not vegans. And so how do we get to the smoking outcome rather than the vegan outcome? And maybe the answer is, well, the vegan outcome is coming in 20 years and we're just not there yet. I'm not old enough to know what it was like in the 80s or when people were smoking. But I don't have an answer to how you get to one or the other. But I think you have to embrace the discomfort because otherwise you're potentially sending the wrong social signal. And like revealing norms and revealing your interiority is important to facilitating change.
It does come with costs.
Yeah. Yes.
I had one little thought I was going to add. I think that it's a really great question and it relates to what Thijs was talking about value instantiations. And I think that, a lot of these things that we're talking about, EVs and plant-based diets and all the sustainable behaviors, they have like two impacts, right? They're either, there's like the direct impact if you are adopting that, but also it's signaling to others something, depending on what it means. But yeah, I think all these things, the symbolism of it shifts over time. Like one long-term consequence of advocating for the financial benefits of adopting EVs or something might be that it does decrease that symbolism, which, is something people might want to weigh up when thinking about how to advocate those. That's kind of what people see already.
Yeah.
I have a very strange thing that happened yesterday. I'm talking about micro behaviors, I would call them, but that a bit into what you all were talking about. I was on the street and then I see someone litter. But they're sitting and eating and taking out whatever they're eating and throwing everything on the floor. So not very wisely, I go and pick it up and say, oh, you dropped it. Obviously, they did it on purpose, right? And this person then starts finishing whatever they're eating there with a group of people and starts littering absolutely everywhere. And so do the rest at the table. So, what do you think about that? I almost ran, by the way, because they were all like killing me to their eyeballs.
So first of all, I think it's very brave what you did. I think most people would not do that. So, and also I can say that I think the research is on your side, and this is the exception, what you found. So most people hate being corrected, right? And that's actually that keeps people in check. the fear that they might get directed, right? So perhaps in this particular situation, it had a counterproductive effect, right? And I think it's a very unusual situation you encountered. But typically, confrontations, as uncomfortable as they are, have a really basically sort of evidence-based basis. Like it keeps norms in check. It prevents norms from eroding. So my advice, I guess, would be don't focus on the group, but focus on the witnesses. Because the witnesses saw you confronting these people, and perhaps those witnesses ultimately had way more impact than this little, I think, idiotic group.
Yeah.
And to follow up on this, I also wonder, is there research about the short-term and long-term effects? Because you're talking about a group of people who might have felt very uncomfortable, but as a group process. And maybe, I study, for example, feminism, and I have this discussion with my mother, and we have a lot of friction. And then later on, I hear her talk about these things to other people, and then I think, hey, I did have an impact, but it was just too conflictual at that moment. Is there research about that on environmental aspects?
Yeah, go ahead.
So also with Maddie and amongst others, we've been looking at moral do-gooder derogation, and this idea that when you speak out and you're a vegan, like you're doing, you might get some backlash. And I think the literature is biased in terms of only document the potential negative effects. And why is that? Because it's just methodologically a lot easier to test short-term effects. Testing these indirect long-term effects is much more difficult. And I think looking at the literature, there's much to say that the negative immediate responses are just defensiveness. And in a way, that's also what in the paper we've been saying, defensiveness in a way is a signal that you've struck a chord. Yeah. Right? So in a way, I think this is basically, I guess that also is underlined by all the research that we talked about today. We need to start using different methods to better understand what is the true impact of these types of interventions.
I once heard a city planner talking about litter, and they had a really great analogy for me, which I think speaks to norm dynamics, which is like litter is driven by like 1% of the population. Like most people will litter, but you just have a group of people who don't care. And so what you need is 2% of the population to tell them off or clean it up, right? And then that's how you get a clean city. You get a clean city where 97% of the people are just following the norm, 1% are breaking it, and 2% are willing to bear the social cost to enforce the norm. And like, I usually think of that when I'm in those contexts too. And I think to the research question, like, when is it the hardest to enforce a norm, but also often the most important is like with your in-group, right? Telling off a stranger, like you were saying that this person was with their friends, right? Yeah. And that speaks to this dynamic. I bet you their friends were probably being like, dude, what are you doing? And it takes someone like an outsider, right? Someone not in that social group to intervene. And that's hard enough as it is, but imagine how much harder it is when you're at the table, right? To like, you know, with a friend, someone you're in group.
Sorry, just jumping on that. So there's even research suggesting it's not only important to confront norm violations, but something we forget, it's also important to reinforce the confronter. Yeah. So there's lots of bystander trait, right? So if you see something happen, speak up. But what is really important is that the rest, basically, once this person speaks up, says, yes, you're actually good that you did that. And I think that's often forgotten because in Dutch, we say, iemand anders heeft de kastanjes uit het vuur gehaald. Somebody else already took took the cost of sort of confronting, and that's it. But you need the rest of the population at least to say, this is not a weirdo, but this person represents my value.
Yeah.
Caring about the environment is not cool. And this is hardly surprising because anything that requires to change your behavior can come off as annoying. So instead of framing the whole intervention as the right thing to do, would it benefit also to frame it as this is also fun? So it's not just the right thing to do. Does it motivate people to tell them this is the right thing to do? Does it? But framing it also as fun could also be, is there a way to do that? And would it be successful? I think
there's definitely lots of ways to do that, and I agree that would be successful. And I would assume maybe that having it fun and both a good thing to do implied is a really useful approach of thinking. You know, if you have vegan cooking classes or something that are portrayed as like a fun activity, but underlying that there's that kind of moral aspect. But yeah, I do think that sometimes it's hard to combine fun and moral. But yeah, I'd be keen to hear what happens.
At the same time, I think that the same logic, I should not. Now I'm discussing it. I should moderate it. But anyway, I think the same logic applies as with the economic argument that we had before, right? If you only focus on the fun, then that behavior is fun, but it might not spread to other behaviors. And another important notion is there's quite some research showing that acting pro-environment also makes you feel good. It's not hedonically, but more eudaimonic feeling. So you feel good about, proud of yourself if you do the right thing. So it's not necessarily that pro-environmental is not fun.
Perhaps to add to I agree with all of that, and just add, I think indeed, as you mentioned, there's also a risk that you think like everything should be fun. That perhaps some things are not fun, and then you don't do this. And in a way, I think like we should not be afraid to embrace a bit of discomfort, as you also said, right? So think about the Zwarte Piet example. Like this needs to be uncomfortable to disrupt this self-perpetuating social norm in some way. And we can say, well, it's not nice that it's uncomfortable. True, but like in a way, sometimes I think where you can, you should make it fun, perhaps. But we should also not be afraid to embrace a bit of the discomfort, a bit of polarization, because it'd be part of the package of the change we need to get.
Yeah.
I have a question relating to people's estimations of carbon impact of different behaviors. I guess I didn't know that people think recycling is more important than it really is. But it was very shocking to me to see the ranking and like how that relates to actual impact. And I was wondering what your views are on how to change this broadly, educational, informational efforts. How to really change this is my question.
You would answer the advice. Well, you can communicate better the environmental impact, but it's oftentimes there's already much earlier research, and it's also oftentimes heuristics, right? We have difficulties assessing very small numbers or very large numbers, things that are not visible. We don't think about it, so it's also making people aware of things, which would mean communication. But at the same time, we know that communication can help, but not only when that is the only barrier for change. And oftentimes there's other barriers for change as well.
Yeah, because I'm also mostly thinking it's been known for so long that recycling isn't so very impactful. So why? And if we know that people should, have more information about this, then why is that still not common sense knowledge or something? After all this time.
Yeah, but I think you now might know for a long time that recycling is impactful, but it doesn't necessarily know that everyone knows, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, both of you. Whoever wants to first.
My co-host, just because I was going to add on to this, because I was thinking about the recycling effect in Jeffrey's presentation. I wonder if the effect could be explained partly by how organisations have a lot of waste programs and recycling programs that are very visible to business representatives, but also their employees, and so they perceive that as being very impactful compared to these hidden policies that they're not aware of and they're not involved in making these decisions. I'm not sure if that's something that people
Yeah, all right. So I assume you all are quite in touch with policymakers in some regard on different levels. And I'm wondering, what is your perception? How aware are those policymakers of the structural barriers, basically, and them being willing to target those barriers? For example, with I had over the project example right now. Imposing change on, for example, in companies or on a local level. So probably also maybe against the willingness of citizens in the first place. So what's your perception there?
So I'm part of a study looking at doing qualitative interviews of people in the C-suite of like large Irish firms that have opted into a sustainability initiative, and this include energy utilities. And so these are the people with the most power and the most motivation. And the title of the paper comes from a direct quote, which is, "We don't know what we're transitioning to." And so their problem, they can identify the systemic barriers in their organization, right? So they can say like, you know, we can do these symbolic things, but we're well aware that we need to better integrate, you know, ESG KPIs into second order processes, et cetera, but they also just lack that grand vision. They're like, they really struggle to articulate what success looks like in 2 years. And this sort of relates to like the policy effectiveness question. Is like, my experience has been like, no matter, like, they tend to be much more accurate in their perceptions, and then it's a whole new set of problems, right? So it's like, you fix the norm perceptions, but then people don't know about policy effectiveness. Well, you fix that perception, and then people, you know, can't implement it, and it's just there's always a different problem that comes up. But at least for business leaders, it's often that. It's just that they lack the grand vision, and they lack examples, right? You can't point to a firm that's done this right? And so there's just letting people realize like, you have to be the trendsetter. But that's really hard for a firm to conceptualize or really embrace, because it's a risky thing to do.
Maddie, you interviewed them specifically. So.
Well, for my interviewees, I would say, you know, a vast majority of them are saying, yes, we need to be shifting the structural constraints, and they were explicitly saying they don't want to just be focusing on individuals and behavior change. And I kind of had a sense that maybe that was they had that kind of reaction because that's what's coming from the top down, is that's what they should be focusing on, but also major barriers with the structural changes of funding. So we've just had big funding cuts, and a lot of these projects actually got put on the back burner because now they don't have any funds for that. But another one that I'm finding interesting is that we have a city that is quite hilly, and they've tried to, the council that was very focused on environmental solutions implemented cycle lanes, but there was a big backlash about that, and people are now saying, well, no one's using them, it was such a waste of money, and so they're struggling now to get people to go out and use them. And so, there's an interesting kind of undercurrent in my context of people being quite resistant to infrastructural changes, and although there is research showing that, you know, once you put it in place, people love it, it doesn't always work out like that, and even the councils kind of struggle to justify that.
Do you want to add something?
Maybe, I think it also really depends on which policymakers you talk to. So I think also for different, so this is mostly anecdotal, so not research, but I think the experience with, if you talk with policymakers, so for instance at the ministry level, I think many people are quite informed about many of these things. But they also struggle in communicating this higher up and actually move this to actual policies. I think also that as soon as it comes down to also being elected and these kind of things, that you then also see that other things start playing a role. So I think at some levels, they might be quite aware of many of those barriers. I think they also face quite some difficulties in translating this into actual policy. And often they are also afraid that it will not immediately result in outcomes and these kind of things, so that it's not directly visible. I think maybe also a bit related to what you just said. And that's for them also a real concern, also for being re-elected and these kind of things. So I think there are also specific concerns that play a role there. And sometimes they might be aware of what's necessary, but also have a hard time implementing it.
If I can follow up, the Dutch Scientific Climate Council just released a report on behavior change related to climate. And one of my main observations of that whole advisory trajectory was it's not the policymakers that are the barriers, the politicians. So I started to make I always use policymakers as an overarching term, but that's totally not correct, because within a minute, we were mostly advising the ministers. So within the ministries, there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of capacity. They know a lot, but it's political parties' ideologies preventing that to happen.
So thanks for that add-on. So this is, I think, an ongoing frustration that I've had. Right? So that there's not just in our field, but in many fields, the science is sort of unequivocally pointing towards this is a good idea and this is a bad idea. And of course, that doesn't mean it gets implemented, right? And in a way, I've been wondering about how do we, and I'm not sure what it's even the role of scientists, but how do we limit the degrees of freedom that politicians can use to just fact-free come up with nonsense and then basically derail whatever the policymakers are telling to them. And I have no idea how to do something about this, whether we should do something about this as scientists, but at least it's a big
I think that's a
frustration.
critical point. To give you an example, I just read the minutes of the parliamentary meeting, and there were just some parties saying like, why is the minister proposing this policy? Because we all know climate change is not happening. How is it possible that this argument is just not dismissed? Just say, shut up, we go now. And that's with a lot of other topics. So I think we as scientists need to do something about this. And that's with a lot of other topics as well. Yeah, I saw now many hands.
Thanks. I wanted to actually follow up on this political discussion. So I was, we are in this meeting talking a lot about like as if, we all represent the society together. But I guess maybe we don't want to polarize in our, all the conference here. But of course, there's a big difference across the political divide, right? We do know and I think you may know the data, the recent data much more, but people on the right, on the right, or conservative governments, in many countries, there is a negative correlation, right, between supporting right-wing governments and believing environmental change, climate change, supporting for environmental policies. I guess so. That's the case. So I was just wondering, how can we create change, particularly, of course, change can happen across the political divide with different behaviors, but I believe the biggest carbon footprint also kind of comes from this other, group. Do you know any maybe examples of social norm change, behavior change movements that particularly happen in the other side of the political divide? So not exactly us, but the other side.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair point that if we talk about we, it's not necessarily, we're here with a specific subgroup. At the same time, I also mentioned during the presentation, sometimes those differences are also exaggerated between the groups. So I think in terms of, for instance, we wrote a paper during not the last elections, but the ones before that, also reflecting on the election outcome. Back then, PVV won, who also presented themselves as being climate skeptic, basically taking a move back to coal and these kind of things. But also, it was not, for hardly anyone, that was the reason to vote for that party. So it's typically for other things. So then it's also sort of, people have the impression, okay, nobody cares about the climate. Well, of course, it's maybe not that high that you actively oppose a party like that. But still, it doesn't mean that those people who vote for PVV or very right-wing people are necessarily against climate issues. And typically you see indeed a correlation, but it's not very strong. And also in terms of where they care about. So also we run a study looking at deeper motivations, values where people care about. There is some correlation. It's rather weak, and it doesn't explain why those people might be against certain policies. What does explain it is typically how to perceive the impacts of these kind of policies. And it might have to do with trust in those people who are sort of suggesting them, but also being more afraid of financial constraints, government control, or these kind of things. So it's not necessarily the topic climate that holds them back from supporting these policies, but what those policies do, by whom they are implemented, and these kind of things. So I think it's a little bit more nuanced than saying left cares about the environment, or we care about the environment, left cares about the environment, or whatever, and they don't. I think there is quite some consensus also in terms of worry about these things. You see that actually among most of those groups, people are concerned about climate change, do care about those topics. It's more about how they sort of look at those more specific behaviors, policies, etc.
Studies on these misperceptions among Democrats and Republicans, and by far the biggest one is in perceptions of Republicans. that most people estimate them like 20%, and they're actually usually part of the majority.
Majority
of who support pro-environmental policies. And so, and they underestimate that too. And in fact, I tried to predict who underestimates Republican support, and the people who do the most are actually us. Being highly educated and having high objective knowledge of climate is one of the strongest predictors of underestimating how much conservatives actually support. And you know, while there are many differences and there's other things going on, like perhaps they don't prioritize it as much. What I see as the problem is not the people on the ground. And I actually find that ideology doesn't predict whether a small business adopts an environmental policy, to my surprise. And what I think is the big problem is the gap between voters and their politicians. But the politicians tend to be much more anti-environmental than the people voting for them, which suggests that maybe the politicians don't know that. I think maybe the voters also don't know that. You see that a lot in politics, where like, the politicians are often much more conservative and right-wing than the right-wing voters themselves.
I just like add a little point. I think also depends on the political system. So I think like we often talk about the US, and they have such a strong just two-party system, but in other countries you do get. So an example I was thinking of was I think in Australia a couple of years ago they had a new party come up that was like the teal version of the national like kind of centre right wing party, and so they were like, we're green but we're also blue, you know. So they were providing that option where people who are more right-wing leaning could vote for a party that cared about the environment. So I think that can also have a...
I got a sign of 5 minutes. I saw Isabel first.
It's related a little to the polarization, social friction, and generally we heard a lot about the social barriers and influence. Pluralistic ignorance, underestimating how much other people care, and then also about speaking up to others, talking about climate change. But then we also know that we are all organized maybe in certain bubbles where we might have more similarities already with the people that we have. So my question is, how do we basically bridge the gap between social bubbles where we might already agree and the societal level change that we are in?
So perhaps I guess anyone else could respond, but so I've been really inspired by the work of Dana Santola, a sociologist. So he talks about
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think one good answer to this question is the work by Dana Santola on his work on complex contagion. So basically what he says is, when it comes to behavior change, there's this popular idea that behavior change goes like a virus, right? One person infects another person and that's how it spreads. And actually, if you look at the data, that's not how it works. Because it typically, behavior change starts in little pockets, the periphery of the network, and those little pockets are overlapping with another pocket, and you get a pocket-to-pocket infection. And then ultimately, well, you get a tipping point. So in a way, I think this idea that going out of the screen bubble on the one hand is a good idea. You need to have these overlapping pockets. And at the same time, it's really important not to forget that this change incubates in pockets. Pockets, in a way, and bubbles are good because they allow you to experiment with new stuff in a safe environment. Right? So you need basically both. So in that sense, bubbles have a negative connotation. I think, yes, you should spread from one bubble to the next, but we shouldn't forget that the bubbles allow change to begin in the first place.
Yeah.
Just one other part of Susan's and Tom's thing was that we talk about wide bridges, right? I don't remember exactly what that is, but I have the sense that it's like, if you're trying to go outside the bubble, then it's helpful to have more than just the one person, right? So that you're not just that sole person connecting with the exterior world. But do you remember?
No, sorry, that's thanks for complimenting. That's actually what I mean with the virus metaphor. So the virus metaphor says it goes from one person to the next. What Santola says, no, you need to have wide bridges. So they have one pocket and another pocket, and there needs to be multiple individuals living in both worlds. Because that means if this one connecting person this drops off, then the two pockets are disconnected. So that's why you need wide bridges, basically.
I think one more that Brian said two already. One, you're a new operation as well. Then we have lunch.
Yeah, as a policymaker for municipalities,
Yes.
it's a struggle that I'm facing is trying to participate with local citizens and everything. And then something that touched upon as well is having money as a main argument for why they should do certain things, and also then trying to explain their own behavior change as financial reasons, while starting looking at the research, thinking like maybe not, but how do I move, or do you have any advice on how to kind of move along on that financial argument and looking into more of these different reasonings and trying to also show that to our politicians and getting it into our policy? I know that's a bit broad, but maybe some thoughts.
Well, anyway.
I thought you had studied this.
Well, I guess sort of really zooming out, right? In a way, the most expensive thing we can do is wait with addressing climate change, right? So in a way, I think that's actually where I think sort of bringing the science not just to basically to the general public and basically allowing politicians, no longer allowing for politicians to say, yes, it's going to be very expensive to do something about climate change. It's going to be way more expensive if we wait, right? So in that sense, I think that perhaps is something we know, but that is something that perhaps isn't as known yet, right? So in that sense, making this more public could limit perhaps the ability to counter-argue this. But I guess you referred to an answer on an individual.
No, I was also thinking that many politicians think about base their decisions on their gut feeling. Money is important, and that's why I was thinking about you. If you ask people what drives you, they often say money. But in many studies, we found that people say that that's their main motivator, but if you look at the evidence, it's not. So that is again also reflecting what you were saying. Base it on the evidence and make them aware of what is going on. And then you can also invite us to do more, because that's also a task for us, of course, to make sure that the knowledge is better accessible to the politicians and policymakers as well. Thank you all very much for being here for this excellent discussion. Next panelists and speakers, you met my expectations more than. So thank you all for being active and participating. And thanks, Sinran, where are you? The spider in the web I said yesterday, it's all thanks to her that we are here today. Thanks for organizing this excellent session. And